Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. Ash Hollow was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. It was a small, sleepy town nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oaks. The air smelled of pine and chimney smoke, and the most exciting thing to ever grace the pages of the Ash Hollow Gazette was a pie-eating contest gone awry. Sarah and Daniel, both 25, had moved there 2 years ago, drawn by its low cost of living and quaint charm. Daniel worked from home as a graphic designer, while Sarah spent her days managing the local coffee shop, the Hollow Grind. Life was predictable, if not downright dull, until the rumors began. It was a Saturday morning when Sarah first overheard the whispers. 2 elderly women sat at the coffee shop counter, their voices hushed but their eyes wide with unease. "Do you think it's true?" one asked, her wrinkled hands trembling around her cup. "Maybe. Evelyn Marrow's curse," they said. 100 years tonight." Sarah's ears perked up, but she didn't interrupt. Evelyn Marrow was a name she'd heard before. The story was a staple of Ash Hollow folklore, whispered at bonfires and Halloween parties. Evelyn had been a midwife accused of witchcraft after several women in town miscarried under her care. In 1925, she was dragged to the town square and burned at the stake. Legend had it, with her dying breath, she cursed the townsfolk, vowing to return and take back the land they had stolen from her. Sarah had always thought it was just a story, the kind of thing small towns clung to for a little drama. But the way the old women spoke, like they were afraid Evelyn might walk through the door at any moment, unsettled her. That evening, Sarah shared the story with Daniel over dinner. "It's just folklore," she said, stabbing her fork into a piece of roast chicken. "But the anniversary's tonight, 100 years. I bet the kids will pull some kind of prank, chalk pentagrams or fake ghosts. Small town fun." Daniel chuckled. "If they want to scare people, they should leave gas station receipts in mailboxes. That's real horror." They laughed, but the unease lingered. After dinner, Daniel went to his office to work on a project while Sarah curled up on the couch with a book. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Sarah glanced up, her eyes drawn to the faint sound of rustling leaves. The streetlights cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment she thought she saw something move in the darkness. A flicker, quick and subtle, like a shadow slipping out of view. She shook her head and returned to her book, but the feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind. The house felt colder than usual, the air heavier. At midnight, Daniel emerged from his office, yawning and stretching. "I'm calling it a night," he said, planting a kiss on Sarah's forehead. "Me too," she replied, setting her book aside. But as they climbed the stairs, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them just out of sight. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of day that made everything feel heavier. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 6, and she groaned, fumbling to silence it. Daniel was still asleep, sprawled out with one leg dangling off the bed. She envied how easily he could tune out the world. By 7, Sarah was jogging her usual route around the outskirts of town. The trail was quiet, except for the crunch of her sneakers on gravel and the occasional chirp of birds. The air smelled damp, like it might rain later. As she rounded a bend, she slowed to a stop, her breath catching in her throat. There, just off the trail, stood a gravestone. It was simple, weathered gray, with no name or date etched into its surface. A single wildflower had grown beside it, leaning toward the stone like it was offering some kind of tribute. Sarah took a cautious step closer, her heart thudding in her chest. It looked old, out of place in the middle of the forest. "Probably a prank," she muttered under her breath, though her voice didn't carry the confidence she'd hoped for. Some bored teenager must have dragged it here as part of the town's weird fascination with the Evelyn Marrow legend. Still, something about the gravestone made her skin crawl. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the rough surface. No name, no inscription, nothing to hint at who it might belong to. Just an eerie, cold feeling that seemed to radiate from the stone itself. Shaking her head, Sarah pulled out her phone and snapped a photo. She'd show Daniel later. Maybe he'd find it funny, or maybe he'd think it was creepy too. Either way, it felt wrong to leave without some kind of proof that she wasn't imagining things. The rest of her run passed uneventfully, but she couldn't shake the image of the gravestone from her mind. When she got back home, Daniel was in the kitchen, pouring cereal into a bowl. "You're up early," Sarah said, setting her phone on the counter. "Deadline," he replied, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What about you? You look tense." Sarah hesitated. She didn't want to sound ridiculous, but the words tumbled out anyway. "I found a gravestone on the trail." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "A gravestone? Out there?" "Yeah, no name on it, just sitting there like it belonged." Daniel grinned. "Maybe it's Evelyn Marrow's. Spooky season, right?" Sarah rolled her eyes and swiped through her phone to show him the picture. But when she opened her gallery, the photo was gone. She frowned, scrolling back and forth. Nothing. "That's weird," she muttered. "I definitely took a picture." Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his expression half amused. "Sounds like you need more sleep. Or maybe the ghost didn't want to be photographed." Sarah laughed, but uneasily. Later, while Daniel buried himself in his work, she couldn't help glancing out the window at the woods beyond their yard. She swore she could see something faint and gray through the trees, though it disappeared every time she tried to focus on it. That night the wind picked up again, rattling the windows like an unwelcome guest. As Sarah stood brushing her teeth in the bathroom, a low, damp draft snaked through the house. It carried with it a faint, earthy smell like moss and freshly dug dirt. When they went to bed, Daniel fell asleep almost immediately. But Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling that same gnawing sensation from the night before. She dreamed of gravestones that night, rows and rows of them, stretching endlessly across the forest floor, all of them blank. And when she woke, the first thing she noticed was the fog. It had crept into the yard overnight, swirling like smoke beneath the pale morning light. And outside, just visible at the edge of the lawn, was another gravestone. The gravestone stood stark and ominous against the pale morning fog, leaning slightly as though it had been there for years. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, her mug of coffee trembling slightly in her hands. It was impossible to ignore now. She couldn't brush this off as a prank anymore, not when the gravestone was sitting in her backyard. Daniel wandered into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Morning," he mumbled, heading straight for the coffee pot. "You're up early again. Couldn't sleep?" "I think you need to see this," Sarah said, her voice tight. She didn't look at him, her eyes glued to the gravestone outside. "What?" Daniel shuffled to the window, his mug in hand. "What are you—" He froze mid-sentence, his words hanging in the air. "Okay, that's weird," he said finally, blinking as if the sight might vanish. Sarah nodded. "I found one on my run yesterday, and now there's one here, in our yard." Daniel set his mug down and rubbed the back of his neck. "It's probably some kid screwing around trying to freak people out. This town loves their spooky legends." Sarah turned to him, her face pale. How would someone move that? It wasn't here yesterday, and now it's just there. Who would do that in the middle of the night without us hearing? Daniel didn't have an answer. He stepped outside, still in his pajamas, to get a closer look. Sarah followed hesitantly, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. The gravestone looked identical to the one Sarah had seen on the trail. Weathered, gray, blank. Daniel crouched and touched its surface, jerking his hand back almost immediately. "It's cold," he muttered, frowning. "Like freezer cold." "That's not normal," Sarah said, taking a step back. "Nothing about this is normal," Daniel replied, straightening up. "We should report it to someone. The cops, maybe?" Sarah snorted, though there was no humor in it. "What are we going to tell them? That gravestones are magically appearing? They'll think we're crazy." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of voices rising from the neighbor's yard. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance before moving toward the fence. Their neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, stood on her porch in her bathrobe, staring down at a gravestone identical to theirs. "Did you?" she stammered, pointing at it, her face pale and drawn. "Did you see who did this?" "No," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We woke up and there was one in our yard, too." The old woman crossed herself, muttering something under her breath. "I knew that witch's curse would catch up with this town someday." Before Sarah could respond, another voice called out, this time from across the street. Mr. Bellows, the retired postman, stood in his driveway, gesturing wildly toward a gravestone that had appeared on his property. By the time the sun was fully up, the entire neighborhood was in chaos. Gravestones had cropped up in nearly every yard, each one identical, each one unmarked. The residents gathered in the street, exchanging theories and accusations, but no one had any answers. The fog, thicker than Sarah had ever seen it, seemed to press against the edges of the town, muffling sound and dulling the morning light. "I think we need to leave," Sarah said quietly to Daniel, who stood beside her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Where would we go?" he asked. "Anywhere. Just away from here." Daniel nodded, but didn't look convinced. As the townsfolk continued to argue and panic, Sarah noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow moved at the edge of the fog, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't the flicker of a branch or the shape of an animal. It was upright, human-like, and still. When she turned to get a better look, it was gone. That night, the knocking began. The knocking was faint at first, just a light tap, tap, tap against the front door. Sarah stirred in bed, her mind fuzzy with the edge of sleep. At first, she thought she'd imagined it. Then it came again, louder this time. She sat up, her pulse quickening. Beside her, Daniel was still fast asleep, his soft breathing steady in the still room. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 2:13 a.m. The knocking didn't stop. It wasn't hurried or frantic, but steady, deliberate. Sarah's first thought was that someone needed help, but a cold dread crawled up her spine. Who would be out at this hour in the thick fog? She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Daniel, and crept to the window overlooking the front yard. The fog was so dense now that she couldn't see beyond the porch light. Everything beyond was an opaque wall of swirling gray. She squinted, trying to make out a figure, but there was nothing. Just the sound of that persistent knock. Her stomach churned as she moved toward the door, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The house felt unnaturally silent, the kind of silence that pressed on your ears, making you hyper-aware of every sound. When she reached the front door, she hesitated. Her hand hovered over the doorknob as the knocking continued. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath hitched as she leaned forward, pressing her eye to the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty. The knocking stopped. A sharp inhale caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp as she strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement. But the silence remained. She turned to retreat upstairs when the sound came again, this time from the back door. Tap, tap, tap. A chill ran down her spine as she froze in place. It wasn't possible. Whoever or whatever was outside had moved to the back of the house in complete silence. Her instincts screamed at her not to look, but her legs moved on their own. She shuffled toward the kitchen, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor as the moonlight filtered through the fog. The back door was glass, offering no hiding place from what lay beyond. As she approached, she could see the faint outline of the backyard. The gravestone was still there, its blank surface partially shrouded in mist. Beyond it, nothing moved. No sign of life, just the fog. And yet the knocking persisted. She reached the door and peered outside. For a moment, her breath caught. The fog had receded slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of the yard where the woods began. There, among the trees, she saw it. A shadow, tall and impossibly thin, standing motionless between the trunks. Its head was tilted as if watching her. Her stomach lurched, and she stumbled back from the door. When she blinked, it was gone, as though it had never been there at all. The fog began to seep against the glass, pressing like a living thing. Sarah backed away, her hands trembling as she grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife. The knocking stopped, replaced by silence so heavy it felt suffocating. A creak echoed through the house, this time from the upstairs hallway. Sarah turned toward the sound, clutching the knife tightly. Her eyes darted to the staircase. Shadows pooled at the top, flickering like candlelight. "Daniel?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response. And then came the sound of footsteps above her, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. Sarah froze at the base of the stairs, her breath shallow. The footsteps above her continued, deliberate and unhurried, the sound of each step stretching into the silence like a taunt. Her grip tightened on the kitchen knife as she called out again, her voice trembling. "Daniel? Is that you?" No answer. Her legs felt like lead as she took a cautious step forward. She strained to listen, every muscle in her body coiled. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the house fell into an unbearable stillness. She couldn't decide which was worse, the sound or the silence. A sharp bang at the front door made her whirl around, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest. This time the knock wasn't polite or steady. It was insistent, almost angry. She stepped back, her eyes darting between the door and the dark staircase above. Trapped between two unknowns, she turned toward the door. If it was someone, a person, maybe they needed help. She clung to that small hope as she approached, forcing her trembling hand to the doorknob. With a quick breath, she yanked the door open. There was no one there, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The fog had pulled back just enough to reveal the street beyond her yard. The gravestones had multiplied. They lined the sidewalks now, stretching down the road like silent sentinels. A cold wind swept past her, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. She slammed the door shut and locked it, pressing her back against the wood as her mind raced. This couldn't be real. Gravestones didn't just appear out of nowhere. She glanced back toward the staircase, her pulse hammering. Whatever was upstairs, she couldn't face it alone. She bolted up the stairs, two at a time, throwing open the bedroom door. Daniel was still in bed, sprawled out with his arm draped over his face. She rushed to him, shaking him awake. "Daniel, get up," she hissed, her voice urgent. "Something's happening. There are gravestones everywhere, and I heard footsteps upstairs." Daniel groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about, gravestones? It's the middle of the night." "Get up," she snapped, her voice sharp enough to make him sit upright. "I'm not crazy. Come look for yourself." Muttering under his breath, Daniel followed her downstairs. When she flung open the front door again, the gravestones were still there, now edging closer to their yard. The fog swirled thick and heavy around them, masking their bases as if the stones were growing up out of the ground. Daniel stared, his jaw tightening. "What the hell?" "I told you," Sarah whispered. "They're moving. Every time we sleep or turn our backs, they get closer." Daniel stepped out onto the porch, staring down the street. "How far do they go?" "I don't know," Sarah said. "But this isn't just us. The whole neighborhood is waking up." As if on cue, lights flickered on in the nearby houses. Voices echoed faintly through the fog, panicked and confused. Across the street, Mr. Bellows stood in his driveway, staring at the gravestones lining his yard. "We need to leave," Sarah said again, her voice trembling. Daniel hesitated, his eyes scanning the fog. "Leave? And go where? What if it's the same everywhere?" The ground beneath their feet felt unsteady, as though the very earth was shifting beneath them. Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him back inside. "We have to try. If we stay, I don't think we'll make it through the night." As the door closed behind them, the fog outside seemed to pulse, pressing closer to the house. And among the gravestones, shadows began to gather. They were no longer standing still. The fog wrapped itself around the house, clinging to the windows and swallowing what little light spilled from the porch. Sarah paced the living room, gripping her phone tightly as she dialed the police for the third time. The line buzzed, static filling her ears before cutting off completely. She tossed the phone onto the couch, her hands shaking. "They're not answering," she said, her voice thin and cracking. "I can't get through to anyone." Daniel was at the window, staring out into the suffocating gray. The gravestones were closer now, unmistakably encroaching. The one that had been in their backyard earlier that morning was now only a few feet from their front porch. Beyond it, shadows moved with slow, deliberate steps, fading in and out of the fog. "They're just standing there," Daniel murmured, his breath fogging the glass. "Waiting." Sarah stopped pacing and turned to him. "Waiting for what?" He didn't answer. His hand tightened on the windowsill, his knuckles white. "We're not going to sit here and let this happen. Pack a bag. We're leaving." Sarah hesitated. The thought of stepping into the fog where those shadows roamed made her stomach churn. But what choice did they have? She nodded and hurried upstairs to grab what she could. Clothes, a flashlight, their car keys. It all felt meaningless, but her hands moved on autopilot. When she came back down, Daniel was standing in the doorway, his own bag slung over his shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. "Ready as I'll ever be," she replied, though her voice betrayed her fear. They opened the front door together. The cold hit them first, damp and biting, followed by the overwhelming stench of earth and rot. The fog was thicker now, curling around their ankles and creeping up their legs as they stepped onto the porch. The gravestone nearest to them seemed taller, its surface glistening as though wet. "Stay close to me," Daniel said, his voice low. They moved down the steps, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the fog. The car was parked at the curb, barely visible in the haze. Sarah kept her eyes on the ground, unwilling to look too closely at the shapes shifting just out of view. "Almost there," Daniel muttered. The sound of footsteps froze them in place. Slow, shuffling and heavy, it came from behind them, closer than it should have been. Sarah's breath hitched as she turned her head, the beam of her flashlight trembling. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, partially obscured by the fog. It was human-shaped, but wrong. Too thin, its limbs too long. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side as if observing them. When the flashlight hit its face, Sarah stumbled back, a scream caught in her throat. It didn't have a face. Where its features should have been, there was only smooth, pale flesh. "Go!" Daniel shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the car. They sprinted the last few feet, Sarah fumbling with the keys as the figure began to move. It didn't walk so much as glide, its long limbs cutting through the fog like a predator stalking its prey. She threw herself into the passenger seat as Daniel started the engine, slamming the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly for a moment before catching traction, and the car lurched backward. Daniel turned the wheel hard, aiming for the main road, but the fog was relentless. Every direction looked the same, the gravestones now scattered across the pavement like obstacles in a maze. "Where's the road?" Sarah cried, her voice breaking. Daniel gritted his teeth, his hands gripping the wheel. "It's here. It has to be." The car screeched to a halt as something slammed into the hood. Sarah screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, as the faceless figure crouched on the windshield, its empty face inches from the glass. It didn't move, its head tilted as if curious. Daniel floored the gas, swerving violently. The figure flew off, disappearing into the fog. But the road ahead was blocked. Gravestones jutted up from the asphalt like jagged teeth, and beyond them the faint outlines of more shadows began to appear. Everywhere they turned, the fog pressed closer. The road wasn't taking them anywhere. It only led them back to where they started. "We can't get out," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We can't leave." Daniel slammed his fist on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. "There has to be a way. There has to." The car sputtered, then died. The headlights flickered once before plunging them into darkness. From the fog, the knocking returned. This time it was on the car windows. The knocking on the car windows came from all sides now, rhythmic and deliberate, as if mocking their attempts to escape. Sarah gripped Daniel's arm, her knuckles white as her breathing grew shallow. The fog pressed in, muffling everything except for that relentless sound. "Don't look," Daniel whispered, his voice taut and trembling. "What do you mean, don't look?" Sarah hissed, her voice cracking. Her gaze darted toward the passenger side window, where a shadow loomed. She could barely make out its outline through the glass, its long, spindly limbs pressed against the car. It didn't move like a person. It twitched, jerking as though it was figuring out how to make its body work. Daniel turned the key in the ignition again, but the car only groaned in response, the engine refusing to turn over. "Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on." The knocking stopped. A sudden silence fell over them, thick and suffocating. Sarah swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her ears. She glanced at Daniel, whose wide eyes were fixed on the windshield. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you—" He pointed. "Look." Sarah followed his gaze, her stomach twisting into knots. The fog outside the windshield had thinned, just enough to reveal what lay ahead. The graveyard was there, impossibly close, its gravestones now crowding the road. The iron gate that had once stood at its entrance was bent and broken, and beyond it, the rows of graves stretched endlessly into the distance. At the center of it all was a single, massive gravestone towering above the rest. It bore a name this time, Evelyn Marrow. It's moved again, Sarah said, her voice trembling. It's right in the middle of town now. Daniel grabbed her arm, his face pale. We need to get out of the car. Sitting here isn't safe. Out there isn't safe either, Sarah snapped, panic rising in her chest. We don't even know what those things are. We'll head back to the house, Daniel said, his tone firm but shaky. We're too exposed out here. We need walls around us. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought of stepping back into the fog, but Daniel was right. The car was no sanctuary. She nodded reluctantly, her grip tightening on the door handle. On 3, Daniel said, his eyes locking with hers. We run straight for the house. Don't stop. Don't look back. Got it? Sarah nodded again. Though her legs felt like jelly, she wasn't sure if she could even move, let alone run. But the look in Daniel's eyes forced her to push past the fear. 1, he said, his voice low. 2, 3. They flung their doors open and bolted into the fog. The cold air stung Sarah's skin as she ran, her footsteps echoing hollowly against the pavement. Shapes flickered in the corners of her vision, but she didn't dare look. The fog seemed alive, shifting and curling as though trying to grab her. Behind her she could hear the sound of Daniel's heavy breathing. The porch light of their house flickered faintly through the haze, a beacon in the suffocating gray. Sarah's chest burned, her heart threatening to burst as she pushed herself harder. They reached the front door together, slamming it shut behind them. Daniel turned the lock, his chest heaving as he braced himself against the door. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing. Then the knocking began again. It came from all sides this time, every door, every window. The walls seemed to vibrate with the force of it, as though the house itself was under siege. Sarah backed away, her hands over her ears. Why won't they stop? She cried, tears streaming down her face. Daniel grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. We need to figure out what this is, why it's happening. There has to be a way to stop it. Stop it? Sarah's voice rose in hysteria. How? Do you want to go out there and ask them nicely? Daniel's gaze flicked toward the bookshelf in the corner of the living room. The legend? Evelyn Marrow. There has to be something in the town records or books about her. Something we missed. The knocking grew louder, the sound now accompanied by the faint groan of wood under pressure. Sarah shuddered, glancing toward the window. Shadows pressed against the glass, their forms unnaturally tall and distorted. Daniel turned to her, his face pale but determined. If we don't figure this out, we're not going to survive the night. The knocking had become relentless, vibrating through the walls and floor like a terrible heartbeat. Sarah flinched with every sound, her fingers trembling as she helped Daniel pull books from the shelves. Dust puffed into the air as they tossed aside cookbooks, old almanacs, and tourist guides, looking for anything that might give them a clue about Evelyn Marrow and the curse that now surrounded them. There's got to be something, Daniel muttered, flipping through pages so quickly they tore. This town's obsessed with its history. Somebody must have written it down. Sarah's hands froze as she pulled a weathered leather journal from the bottom shelf. The cover was unmarked, but the pages inside were filled with faded ink, written in a cramped, spidery hand. She held it up to Daniel. What about this? He snatched it from her and skimmed the first few pages, his eyes narrowing. It's her diary, Evelyn Marrow's. Someone must have taken it after she died. The knocking paused, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. The shift was worse than the sound. It felt deliberate, like the house itself was holding its breath. Daniel kept reading aloud, his voice low and urgent. They think they can take my land, my life, and not pay the price. But they will all pay. The bloodline of Ash Hollow will be mine, one by one. He stopped, glancing at Sarah. She cursed everyone in the town. This isn't just about us. Sarah gripped the back of a chair to steady herself. What does it mean? What are we supposed to do? Daniel flipped another page, his finger tracing the text. The curse will rise when the soil remembers. 100 years from now, the dead will reclaim the living. He looked up, his face pale. The graveyard. It's their way of taking the town back. Sarah's stomach twisted. But why now? Why us? Daniel turned another page and froze. On the 100th anniversary, the key lies with the one who carries my name. My blood is their salvation or their undoing. Sarah frowned, trying to make sense of the words. Her name, her blood? What does that mean? Daniel's expression darkened. It means someone in this town is related to her. The curse is tied to them. Before Sarah could respond, a loud crash came from the kitchen. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the house as something forced its way in. The silence shattered, replaced by a low, guttural moan that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They're inside, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the stairs. We need to keep reading. There has to be a way to stop this. They fled to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. Daniel shoved a dresser in front of the door while Sarah flipped through the diary, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the pages. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. Here, Sarah cried, pointing to a passage. The soil must be cleansed with fire. Only then will the dead return to rest. Daniel stared at her, his eyes wide. Fire? What kind of fire? Do we burn the graveyard, the gravestones? I don't know, Sarah admitted, her voice cracking, but it's the only clue we have. The door rattled behind them, the sound of nails scraping against wood. A deep, distorted voice came through the cracks, low and almost melodic. Let us in. Sarah clutched the diary to her chest, her heart pounding. We can't stay here. We have to go to the graveyard. Daniel shook his head. That's insane. You saw what's out there. It doesn't matter, she snapped. If we stay here, we're dead anyway. At least out there, we have a chance. The door began to splinter, a long crack running down its center. Daniel glanced at Sarah, then back at the door. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Okay, let's do it. They grabbed the supplies they had, a lighter, a flashlight, and the diary, and climbed out the bedroom window onto the roof. The fog swirled below them, thick and pulsating as though alive. Shadows darted through the mist, their movements erratic and unnatural. Sarah gripped Daniel's hand tightly as they lowered themselves to the ground. The gravestones were closer now, crowding the yard and forming a path that led straight to the town square. At the center of it all, Evelyn Merrow's towering gravestone loomed like a monument to their impending doom. We burn the soil, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. We end this tonight. The fog thickened as Sarah and Daniel stumbled into the town square, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the suffocating gray. The graveyard now engulfed nearly everything. Rows of gravestones jutted from the pavement, cracking through asphalt, as though the ground itself was rejecting the town. The buildings around the square were barely visible, their shapes swallowed by the encroaching mist. At the center of it all stood Evelyn Merrow's gravestone. It towered above the others, its surface polished black and etched with strange, glowing symbols that seemed to pulse in time with the heavy silence. The ground around it was cracked and dark, oozing a slick, tar-like substance. They're everywhere, Sarah whispered, her eyes darting to the shadows that lurked just beyond the reach of their flashlights. The figures were closer now, no longer content to linger at the edges. They moved with purpose, their long, twisted limbs gliding soundlessly through the fog. Keep moving, Daniel said, his voice low but firm. He gripped Sarah's hand tightly as they made their way to the massive gravestone. The diary felt heavy in Sarah's backpack, its words echoing in her mind. The soil must be cleansed with fire. As they approached, the air grew colder, biting at their skin and cutting through their clothes. The symbols on Evelyn's gravestone flared brighter, casting an eerie green light that illuminated the surrounding fog. Sarah's stomach churned as the light revealed more shadows, dozens of them closing in. We have to hurry, Daniel said, pulling the lighter from his pocket. He knelt near the base of the gravestone, his hands trembling as he tried to ignite the lighter. The flame sputtered once, then caught, casting a tiny circle of warmth in the freezing air. What do we burn? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. She looked around desperately, her breath visible in the cold. The gravestone? The ground? Daniel opened the diary, flipping to the passage they'd found earlier. It just says the soil. I think it means this, he said, pointing to the dark, tar-like substance seeping from the ground around Evelyn's gravestone. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. The air around the gravestone felt wrong, heavy with a presence she couldn't explain. But she nodded, grabbing a stick from the ground and dipping it into the black ooze. It came away coated in the slick substance, which clung to the wood like molasses. Daniel held the lighter steady, bringing the flame to the coated stick. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ooze ignited with a sudden, violent flare, the flame burning green and gold. The light cast long, flickering shadows across the gravestones, and a low guttural roar echoed through the square. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the fire spread, licking at the base of Evelyn's gravestone. The tar-like substance hissed and bubbled, releasing a foul-smelling smoke that made Sarah gag. But the fire grew, spreading in tendrils across the ground, consuming the black ooze and sending plumes of green-tinged flames into the air. The shadows around them howled, their distorted figures writhing as if in pain. They began to retreat, dissolving into the fog. But the victory was short-lived. The ground cracked open with a deafening roar, splitting beneath the gravestone and revealing a gaping chasm of darkness. From the depths, a shape began to emerge, tall, gaunt, and unmistakably human. Evelyn Marrow. Her figure was skeletal, her face twisted into a mocking grin. Her hollow eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the gravestone symbols, and her long, bony fingers reached out toward Sarah and Daniel. "You think fire will stop me?" she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. "This town is mine." Daniel grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back. "We need to do something else. The fire isn't enough." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to remember the diary's warnings. "The bloodline," she said suddenly, her eyes widening. "She said her bloodline is the key. What if—" Before she could finish, Evelyn lunged toward them, her movements impossibly fast. Daniel shoved Sarah behind him, raising the burning stick as a feeble defense. The flame flared brightly, forcing Evelyn to recoil with a screech, but it didn't stop her for long. Sarah reached into her bag, her hands fumbling for the diary. Her fingers found the leather cover, and she pulled it out, flipping desperately through the pages. The firelight illuminated a passage she hadn't seen before, written in bold, jagged letters. "The bloodline must seal what the fire cleanses. Only then will the dead return to rest." She looked up at Daniel, her chest tightening. "It's not just fire. It's me. I think—" She hesitated, her voice faltering. "I think I'm part of her bloodline." Daniel's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I don't know how, but I think that's why this is happening now. It's my fault." Evelyn's skeletal grin widened as she turned her glowing eyes toward Sarah. "You cannot escape what you are," Evelyn hissed. "Join me and we will rule together." Evelyn Marrow's skeletal form loomed closer, her glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. The ground beneath them cracked and groaned, splitting further apart as the cursed fire spread. The fog writhed like a living thing, and the distant howls of the shadows grew fainter, retreating as the flames consumed the black ooze. Sarah's chest heaved as she clutched the diary to her chest. Her mind raced. If she truly was part of Evelyn's bloodline, then the curse was tied to her existence. She felt a sharp pang of guilt, but there was no time for self-pity. This wasn't just about her, it was about the entire town. "Sarah," Daniel shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. "What does it say? What do we do?" She glanced down at the passage in the diary, her hands trembling. "The bloodline must seal what the fire cleanses." The words repeated in her head like a mantra. "Seal it. But how?" Evelyn's voice interrupted her thoughts, smooth and venomous. "You feel it, don't you? The power in your blood. You belong with me, child. You don't have to fight. Together we can remake this town in my image." Sarah's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You don't own me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "This ends now." Evelyn's twisted grin faltered, and her glowing eyes narrowed. "You think you can defy me? Foolish girl." Before Sarah could react, Evelyn lunged toward her, skeletal fingers outstretched. Daniel moved instinctively, stepping between them and shoving Evelyn back with the burning stick. The flames licked at her bony form, and she shrieked, recoiling into the fog. "Do it now," Daniel shouted. "Whatever you have to do, do it." Sarah dropped the diary and knelt near the blackened soil where the fire raged. The words in the diary echoed in her mind, and something inside her clicked. She knew what she had to do. Her blood was the key. the final piece of the curse. She pulled the knife from her pocket, the one she'd grabbed in a moment of panic earlier. Her hand shook as she pressed the blade against her palm. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Daniel yelled, panic flashing across his face. "It's the only way," she said, her voice breaking. "It has to be me." Before she could second-guess herself, she dragged the blade across her palm, wincing as the sharp pain bit through her skin. Blood welled up, dripping onto the cracked earth below. As it hit the soil, the ground shuddered violently. The fire flared, rising in golden columns that illuminated the entire graveyard. Evelyn screamed, her voice piercing and inhuman. Her form began to dissolve, her bones crumbling into ash as the fire consumed her. "This isn't over," she shrieked, her voice fading into the void. "You cannot escape what you are." The ground beneath the gravestone split open, swallowing it whole along with Evelyn's remains. The fire roared one final time before extinguishing itself, leaving only smoldering embers in its wake. The fog began to lift, retreating into the trees like a tide pulling back from the shore. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her hand still bleeding as she clutched it to her chest. Daniel was at her side in an instant, wrapping his arms around her. "It's over," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You did it." She wanted to believe him, but a part of her wasn't so sure. As the smoke cleared, the gravestones remained, scattered across the town square like silent witnesses to the horror that had unfolded. The air was still heavy, the silence unnatural. The following morning, the residents of Ash Hollow emerged from their homes cautiously, their faces pale and drawn. The gravestones were still there, but the shadows were gone. The fog had vanished, leaving the town bathed in an eerie golden light. Sarah and Daniel watched from their porch as the townsfolk gathered in the square. No one spoke about what had happened. They didn't need to. The haunted looks in their eyes said enough. Sarah's hand throbbed as she unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The cut had stopped bleeding, but the scar it left behind was strange, twisted almost like a sigil. She traced it with her finger, her stomach sinking. That night, as she sat alone in the living room, Sarah glanced out the window. The fog was gone, but at the far edge of the woods, she thought she saw something familiar. A gravestone, just one, standing alone in the shadows. Her blood ran cold as she noticed the faint flicker of movement behind it. Something tall, something watching. The curse wasn't over. It had just found a new beginning. Hey Reddit, I've never shared a story like this before, but I need to get it off my chest. This memory has been haunting me, and recent events have brought it all back in a way that's impossible to ignore. Bear with me. It might sound weird, but I promise it's true. Growing up, I had an imaginary friend named Mr. Bailey, or at least that's what I thought at the time. He was an old man, kind of hunched over, with a friendly but somewhat eerie demeanor. I was around 5 or 6 when he first appeared. My mom always told me that kids make up imaginary friends, so I didn't think much of it. But looking back now, things were far stranger than I realized. Mr. Bailey would visit me mostly in the evenings, just before bedtime. He would come into my room, sit on the edge of my bed, and tell me stories. These weren't your typical bedtime stories, though. They were vivid tales about places I had never heard of, filled with strange creatures and mysterious events. His voice was soft and calming, yet there was something unsettling about his presence. One particular evening stands out. I was drawing in my room, using those thick, waxy crayons that little kids love. Mr. Bailey came in and sat beside me. He started to hum an old tune, something that sounded like it was from another era. I asked him where he learned it, and he told me it was a song from his childhood. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems odd that he had such detailed memories of a life that wasn't mine. Whenever I mentioned Mr. Bailey to my mom, she would smile indulgently and nod, probably thinking it was just a phase. I remember telling her about the stories he told me and how he seemed so real. She would just say, "That's nice, honey," and go back to whatever she was doing. There was one time, though, when I showed her a drawing I had made with Mr. Bailey's help. It was a picture of our house with a figure standing in front of it. The figure was an old man, and I had drawn him in such detail that it was clear it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. My mom's face turned pale when she saw it. She asked me who the man was, and I told her it was Mr. Bailey. She didn't say anything after that, just took the drawing and put it away in a drawer. I didn't see it again, and she never brought it up. A few days ago, I was browsing the dark web out of curiosity, reading through creepy stories about imaginary friends. One story caught my eye. It was about a child whose imaginary friend turned out to be a spirit. As I read, memories of Mr. Bailey flooded back. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Mr. Bailey wasn't just imaginary. I began to remember things I had suppressed, like how he knew things no imaginary friend should know, and how he would sometimes leave my room and I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway, even though no one else was around. I even found an old photo of my family standing in front of our house. At the edge of the photo, barely noticeable, was a shadowy figure. It looked a lot like Mr. Bailey. I showed the photo to my mom, and her reaction was immediate and intense. She grabbed it from my hand, stared at it for a long moment, and then hurried out of the room. Later, she told me it was just a trick of the light, but I could see the fear in her eyes. That's where I'll leave it for now. I'll post more about this later if anyone's interested. It feels good to finally share this, even if it's just with strangers on the internet. There's so much more to tell, and some of it still gives me chills. Thanks for reading, and stay tuned for the next part if you want to know more. Thanks for sticking around, Reddit. Here's part 2 of my story. After finding that old photo and seeing my mom's reaction, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. My curiosity was piqued, and I started digging through old family albums and boxes of keepsakes stored in our attic. I hoped to find more clues about Mr. Bailey, even though a part of me was terrified of what I might uncover. One rainy afternoon, I finally found something. Tucked away in a dusty old box, I discovered a bundle of my childhood drawings. Most of them were innocent enough, stick figures, colorful houses, and the like. But as I flipped through them, a chill ran down my spine. There were several drawings of the old man, Mr. Bailey. In one, he was sitting at the edge of my bed just as I remembered. Another showed him standing in the hallway, his face turned towards my room. The drawings were crude, as you'd expect from a child, but the detail I put into his figure was unsettling. What caught my attention the most was a particular drawing that depicted Mr. Bailey standing by my window at night, a full moon behind him. His eyes seemed to glint with an eerie light, and there was a distinct, almost lifelike quality to his face. It was as if I had captured his essence on paper, something beyond the capabilities of a child's imagination. I brought the drawings down and showed them to my mom, hoping she could provide some answers. She looked through them silently, her expression growing more troubled with each picture. When she reached the one of Mr. Bailey by the window, she abruptly stopped and handed them back to me. "I don't remember you drawing these," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Where did you find them?" "In the attic," I replied. "Why, Mom, who is Mr. Bailey? You seem to know more than you're telling me." She took a deep breath and sat down at the kitchen table. "I think it's time we talked," she said, her tone serious. What she told me next made my skin crawl. Apparently, our house had a history that my parents never discussed with me. Before we moved in, it belonged to an old man named Mr. Bailey. He was a recluse, known in the neighborhood for being somewhat odd, but generally harmless. He had lived alone for years after his wife passed away. One winter night, he was found dead in his home, supposedly of natural causes. His body was discovered in the very room that later became my bedroom. My mom said they didn't think much of it when they bought the house, aside from it being a sad story. But now, with the drawings and my vivid memories of Mr. Bailey, she was starting to fear there was more to the story. I asked her why she never mentioned any of this before. She explained that she thought my stories about Mr. Bailey were just a child's imagination, and that mentioning the old man's history would only fuel my fantasies. But now, she was beginning to question everything. To add to the eeriness, my mom confessed that she had also experienced strange occurrences in the house. She would hear footsteps in the middle of the night, doors would creak open by themselves, and sometimes she'd feel an inexplicable chill. She always brushed it off as the house settling or her mind playing tricks on her. But now, she wasn't so sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house sent my heart racing. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, half expecting Mr. Bailey to appear at any moment. Around midnight, I heard it. The familiar sound of soft footsteps in the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew closer, then stopped right outside my door. Holding my breath, I listened intently. After a few moments of silence, I gathered the courage to get up and open the door. The hallway was empty, but a faint, cold draft brushed past me, sending shivers down my spine. I quickly shut the door and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like I did when I was a kid. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went online and found old newspaper articles about Mr. Bailey. Most were just obituaries and brief mentions of his passing, but one article stood out. It was a report from a local historian mentioning that Mr. Bailey was known for telling fantastical stories to the neighborhood children. He had a particular fondness for one little girl who used to visit him often. The girl's name was never mentioned, but I couldn't help but wonder if she too had experienced something similar to what I did. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone in this. I'll stop here for now. The more I uncover, the deeper this mystery seems to go. If you're interested, I'll continue with what happened next. Thanks for reading, and stay safe out there. Hey everyone, thanks for your interest in my story. Here's the third part. Things are getting even stranger, so buckle up. After finding out about Mr. Bailey's history and the eerie experiences in our house, I couldn't stop thinking about him. My mom and I decided it was time to investigate further, so we started searching for more clues about his life and our house. We began in the attic, where I had found my old drawings. As we sifted through boxes of old stuff, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn and the pages were yellowed with age. I flipped it open carefully, and to my surprise, it was Mr. Bailey's journal. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing his daily life, gardening, and occasional trips to town. But as I read on, the entries took a darker turn. He began writing about feeling watched and hearing whispers at night. He described seeing shadows moving in the corners of his vision and feeling an icy chill in the air. The more I read, the more it felt like Mr. Bailey was documenting the same experiences we were having. One entry in particular stood out. It was dated just a few days before his death. There is a presence in this house, I am sure of it now. The footsteps, the cold drafts, and the shadows. It's as if the house itself is alive. I feel it most strongly in the room that will one day belong to a child. There is something here that is not of this world. I fear I may not have much time left. I must warn whoever comes after me. Chills ran down my spine as I read his words. It seemed like Mr. Bailey had been experiencing the same eerie occurrences that we were. The fact that he mentioned the room that would one day be mine made it all the more unsettling. I showed the journal to my mom, and she looked just as disturbed as I felt. We decided to dig deeper into the house's history. We contacted the local historical society and managed to get in touch with a historian who had written about Mr. Bailey. She was intrigued by our story and offered to help us uncover more about the house. A few days later, we met with her at the Historical Society's office. She showed us old maps, photographs, and documents related to our house and its previous owners. That's when we discovered something truly shocking. Before Mr. Bailey, there had been a series of families who lived in the house, and all of them reported strange occurrences. One family in the 1940s claimed their young daughter had an imaginary friend who she described as an old man. Another family in the 1960s moved out abruptly after their son had recurring nightmares about an old man watching him from the hallway. It seemed like Mr. Bailey wasn't the only one who experienced these strange events. The historian explained that the house had a reputation for being haunted, but most of the stories were dismissed as local folklore. She suggested that we might be dealing with a residual haunting, an imprint of past events that kept replaying. That night, as we sat in our living room discussing everything we had learned, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The house felt colder than usual, and every creak and groan seemed amplified. My mom suggested that we should consider moving, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. I needed to understand what was happening. I spent the next few days reading through Mr. Bailey's journal, trying to piece together his experiences. One entry mentioned a small door in the basement that he always kept locked. He wrote that he felt an intense fear whenever he was near it, as if something on the other side was waiting for him. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check out the basement door. With a flashlight in hand, I made my way down the creaky stairs. The air grew colder as I approached the far corner of the basement. There it was, a small wooden door, barely noticeable behind some old furniture. Taking a deep breath, I moved the furniture aside and reached for the door handle. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passage. The smell of damp earth and something else, something foul, wafted out. At that moment, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but no one was there. The basement was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around me. I slammed the door shut and raced back upstairs. I told my mom what had happened, and she agreed that it was time to leave the house. We packed our bags that night and stayed at a nearby hotel. The next day, we started looking for a new place to live. I still have so many questions, and part of me wants to go back and explore that basement passage. But another part of me knows that some things are better left undiscovered. That's it for now. I'll share more if anything else comes up, but for now we're focusing on moving and leaving this haunted past behind us. Hey Reddit, I'm back with part 4 of my story. A lot has happened since we decided to leave the house, and I think you'll find this part particularly intriguing. After our hurried departure from the house, my mom and I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was nothing fancy, but it felt safe, and that's what mattered most. We were determined to leave the unsettling experiences behind us. But as it turned out, the house wasn't done with us yet. A few weeks into our new living situation, I received a call from the historian we had met at the local historical society. She sounded excited, almost anxious, and asked if we could meet. She mentioned finding something important that she thought we needed to see. My curiosity got the better of me, and we arranged to meet at her office the next day. When we arrived, she greeted us with a thick file of documents and a large, old map of our previous neighborhood. She pointed to our old house and then to several other houses nearby. According to her research, our house and the surrounding area had a history of mysterious events dating back over a century. What she uncovered was a pattern. Every few decades, strange occurrences were reported by the residents of our house and a few others in the vicinity. The reports were eerily similar: sightings of an old man, unexplained cold spots, and footsteps in the night. The historian believed that the area might have been the site of something tragic or significant long ago, something that left a lingering presence. She handed me a specific document that caught my eye, a letter dated from the late 1800s. It was written by a woman named Mary, who lived in the house with her young son. In the letter, Mary described her son's new friend, an old man who would visit him at night and tell him stories. She expressed her growing concern about the man, who seemed too real to be imaginary. The letter ended abruptly, with Mary stating her intention to leave the house as soon as possible. There were no follow-up letters or records of what happened to Mary and her son, but the parallels to my own experiences were undeniable. As we pored over the documents, the historian shared another intriguing theory. She believed that Mr. Bailey might not have been just another victim of the house's haunting. but rather a conduit. His strong presence and his affinity for storytelling could have made him an anchor for the restless spirits in the area. When he died, his spirit might have been bound to the house, continuing the cycle of hauntings. Feeling a mix of dread and fascination, I decided to confront my past once and for all. I wanted closure, and I knew the only way to get it was to go back to the house. I discussed it with my mom, who was understandably hesitant but supportive. We agreed to visit during the day, when the house seemed less intimidating. Armed with Mr. Bailey's journal, a flashlight, and a sense of determination, we returned to the house. The new owners had moved in, but luckily they were out, and I still had the old keys. We entered quietly, the familiar creaks and groans of the house greeting us like old friends. I led the way to the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. The small door was still there, hidden behind the furniture. This time, I was prepared. I opened the door and shone my flashlight into the dark passage. The passage was narrow and musty, leading to a small, hidden room. Inside, we found something I hadn't expected, a collection of old, dusty books and personal items that seemed to belong to Mr. Bailey. Among them was a tattered notebook that appeared to be a continuation of his journal. I carefully opened the notebook and began to read. Mr. Bailey had documented his final days in the house, describing how the strange occurrences had intensified. He wrote about the old man visiting him at night, just as he had visited me. The entries grew more frantic, as if he was trying to make sense of what was happening. The last entry was the most chilling. I fear my time is near. The old man is not just a spirit. He is something more, something ancient. I can feel him pulling me towards the darkness. If anyone finds this, please do not stay in this house. Leave and never return. As I finished reading, the air in the room grew colder. I could feel the presence of something watching us. My mom and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the same unease. We decided it was time to leave, for good this time. We left the house and never looked back. The historian continued her research, and we stayed in touch. But I knew I had to move on with my life. The experience left me with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. Mr. Bailey wasn't just an imaginary friend. He was real, and the house had a darkness that went far beyond a simple haunting. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me through this journey. Here's the final part of my story. If you've followed along this far, I appreciate your patience. Let's wrap this up. After leaving the house for the last time, my mom and I tried to resume a normal life. We settled into our new apartment, and things slowly returned to normal. The eerie experiences began to feel like distant memories, though the mystery of Mr. Bailey and the house still lingered in the back of my mind. One evening, a few months after our visit to the house, I received a call from the historian. She sounded more excited than usual, saying she had uncovered something significant about the area around our old house. She invited us to the Historical Society to share her findings. When we arrived, she greeted us with a stack of documents and a determined look in her eyes. She had discovered that the land our house was built on had a much older history than we realized. Long before the neighborhood was developed, the area had been the site of a small settlement in the early 1800s. The settlement was abandoned under mysterious circumstances, with local legends hinting at strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances. One legend in particular stood out. It told of an old man who was believed to be a protector of the land. He was described as a storyteller who kept the community entertained with tales of spirits and otherworldly beings. However, as the legend goes, he crossed paths with something dark and powerful, a spirit that did not want to be disturbed. The old man was never seen again, but his presence was said to linger, tied to the land, watching over it even in death. The historian theorized that this old man could be the same entity that had haunted our house and the surrounding area. His spirit, once a protector, might have become something more sinister over time, especially after his encounter with the dark spirit.
This theory seemed to explain the recurring sightings of the old man and the strange events reported by different families over the decades.
With this new understanding, I felt a strange sense of closure. It didn't answer all my questions, but it gave me a clearer picture of what might have been happening. The old man, Mr. Bailey, or perhaps someone even older, was a part of the land's history, intertwined with its mysteries. I decided to share our story with the new owners of the house. It felt like the right thing to do, to warn them and give them a chance to make their own decisions. They were skeptical at first, but as I recounted our experiences and showed them the historian's findings, I saw the worry in their eyes. They thanked me and promised to look into it further. Life went on, and I focused on moving forward. The experiences left a mark on me, but I refused to let them define my life. I found solace in knowing that we had tried to understand and address the mystery, rather than simply running away from it. Years passed, and my mom and I eventually moved to another city. The memories of Mr. Bailey and the house faded, but never completely disappeared. Every so often, I would dream of the old man, standing silently in the hallway, watching over us. But these dreams no longer filled me with fear. They were just reminders of a strange chapter in my life. Recently, I revisited the dark web out of curiosity. I found myself reading more stories about imaginary friends and hauntings, and I was struck by how many people had similar experiences. It made me realize that our story wasn't unique. Many others had encountered the unexplainable, and sharing our stories helped us all feel a little less alone. I've learned to accept that some things in life are beyond our understanding. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them can be solved. But that's okay. It's part of what makes life interesting. Thanks for reading my story. I hope it's been as intriguing for you as it has been for me to share. Remember, if you ever encounter something strange or unexplainable, don't be afraid to seek the truth, but also know when to let go. Some mysteries are meant to remain as they are, unanswered and eternal. I've always been pretty cautious about the internet. I mean, who isn't these days? With all the horror stories about identity theft, viruses, and the dark web, it pays to be careful. But curiosity got the better of me one night. I was on a forum, just scrolling through various threads about creepy experiences, and someone mentioned the dark web. They described it as this hidden part of the internet where anything goes. Illegal activities, disturbing content, you name it. For some reason, I felt this inexplicable urge to check it out. Big mistake. After a few hours of watching tutorials and setting up Tor, the browser you need to access the dark web, I found myself in a chat room that was hosting some sort of auction. People were bidding on strange artifacts, bizarre relics, and even what appeared to be cursed items. One item caught my eye, an old, weathered book with a strange symbol on its cover. The title was in a language I didn't recognize, but it was described as a cursed tome. I don't know what possessed me, but I placed a bid. It was way out of my budget, but I was outbid quickly, and I left the chat room feeling a weird mix of disappointment and relief. That night, I had a vivid dream. I was in a dimly lit room, and an old lady with piercing blue eyes was staring at me from across the room. She didn't say anything. She just stared, unblinking. I woke up drenched in sweat. The image of her eyes burned into my mind. I brushed it off as a result of my late-night internet adventures and tried to go about my day. A few days later, I saw her. I was at the grocery store, just picking up some milk and cereal when I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned around, and there she was, standing at the end of the aisle, staring at me. Her appearance was just like in my dream, old with a weathered face and those same piercing blue eyes. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. I quickly paid for my groceries and rushed out, my heart pounding in my chest. Over the next few weeks, I saw her everywhere. At the bus stop, in the park, even outside my workplace, always at a distance, always staring. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. Friends and family didn't notice her, or if they did, they didn't think much of it. Just a harmless old lady, they'd say. But I knew better. There was something deeply unsettling about her presence. I tried to retrace my steps, figure out why this was happening. My mind kept going back to that night on the dark web. Had I unknowingly invited something sinister into my life? The thought gnawed at me, and I began to research curses and hexes, trying to find any clue that could explain my situation. Most of what I found was either too vague or too extreme to be useful. One evening, I decided to confront her. I was in the park, sitting on a bench, pretending to read a book, when I felt her eyes on me. She was standing near the playground, watching me as always. Summoning all my courage, I walked over to her. My hands were trembling, my throat dry, but I managed to speak. "Why are you following me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving mine. "You shouldn't have looked," she said in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling. "Now it's too late." I didn't know what to say. Her words filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. "What do you mean? What did I look at?" Instead of answering, she reached out and placed a cold, bony hand on my arm. "Be careful," she whispered. "The curse is only beginning." Before I could react, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I stood there frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. The curse is only beginning. What did that mean? And why me? As I made my way home, my mind raced with questions. I couldn't shake the feeling that my life was about to take a turn for the worse. Little did I know, the old lady's warning was just the beginning of a nightmare that would turn my world upside down. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't stop thinking about the old lady's warning. Every shadow seemed menacing, every creak in my apartment a sign of impending doom. My friends started noticing my unease, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the old lady and the curse. Who would believe me? One evening, as I was browsing the internet in an attempt to distract myself, I stumbled upon a forum dedicated to supernatural experiences. Hesitant at first, I decided to post my story, hoping for some advice or at least a sympathetic ear. The responses were mixed. Some people mocked me, others shared their own eerie encounters, and a few offered possible explanations. One comment, however, stood out. It was from a user named Hex Hunter, who claimed to have experience dealing with curses. "Sounds like you've attracted a spirit tied to an object or event," Hex Hunter wrote. "Think back. Did you come into contact with anything unusual recently? Sometimes even bidding on a cursed item can draw attention." The dark web auction. It had to be connected. I replied to Hex Hunter, explaining my situation and mentioning the old book I had bid on. He suggested that I try a cleansing ritual, something simple to start with, like burning sage and reciting a protective prayer. I figured it couldn't hurt and decided to give it a try. The next day, I bought a bundle of sage and found a prayer online that seemed fitting. That evening, I followed the instructions, moving through my apartment with the sage, reciting the prayer with as much conviction as I could muster. The smoke filled the rooms, leaving a lingering scent that was strangely comforting. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. But that night, the dreams returned, more vivid and disturbing than before. The old lady was closer this time, her eyes more intense, almost as if she could see into my soul. She didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. The next morning I felt a sense of dread hanging over me. I decided to take the day off work and visit a local library to research curses and protective measures more thoroughly. I spent hours sifting through old books and articles, most of which were unhelpful or too obscure to understand. Just as I was about to give up, a librarian approached me. "You seem troubled," she said kindly. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" I hesitated, but decided to be honest. "I think I might be cursed," I admitted, feeling slightly ridiculous. She didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "There are many kinds of curses," she said. "Some are tied to objects, others to places or people. Have you considered speaking to a professional?" "A professional?" I echoed, not sure what she meant. "A spiritual advisor or a medium," she clarified. "Someone who can help you understand what you're dealing with and guide you in lifting the curse." I hadn't considered that. The idea of seeking out a medium felt a bit outlandish, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. She gave me the name of a local medium who had a good reputation, and I decided to make an appointment. When I arrived at the medium's small, cluttered shop, I was greeted by a woman named Clara. She had a calm, soothing presence that immediately put me at ease. I told her everything about the old lady, the dark web auction, the dreams, and the constant feeling of being watched. She listened intently, never interrupting. "This spirit," she said finally, "is tied to you because of your curiosity. Sometimes the act of seeking out the unknown can open doors to things we don't understand. Can you help me?" I asked, desperate for a solution. Clara nodded. "I can try. We'll need to perform a ritual to sever the connection. It won't be easy, and you must be prepared for things to get worse before they get better." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I agreed. We scheduled the ritual for the following week, and she gave me a list of preparations. I left the shop feeling a mix of hope and trepidation. As I walked home, I saw the old lady again. She was standing on the corner of my street, her eyes fixed on me. This time I didn't feel fear. I felt resolve. I was going to end this, whatever it took. Little did I know, the coming days would test my resolve in ways I couldn't have imagined. The days leading up to the ritual were some of the longest and most unsettling of my life. Every moment was filled with an intense sense of foreboding, as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting to be pushed. Clara had given me a detailed list of preparations, and I threw myself into following them, hoping to stave off the anxiety gnawing at me. First, I had to cleanse my living space thoroughly. This meant more sage smudging, as well as sprinkling salt in the corners of every room. I even had to place a bowl of water with a few drops of holy oil near my front door. Clara explained that these measures would help to purify my home and create a barrier against negative energies. I followed her instructions to the letter, even though it felt a bit like a scene from a horror movie. One evening, as I was finishing up the cleansing, my phone rang. It was my best friend, Mark. We hadn't spoken much since this whole ordeal began, mainly because I didn't want to drag him into my mess, but hearing his voice was a welcome distraction. "Hey, man, you've been MIA lately. Everything okay?" he asked. I hesitated, not sure how much to reveal. "Yeah, just dealing with some stuff," I said vaguely. "Stuff? Like what?" Taking a deep breath, I decided to tell him the truth. "I think I might be cursed," I admitted, recounting the entire story. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You're serious?" he finally said. "Dead serious." To my surprise, Mark didn't laugh or mock me. Instead, he offered to come over and help me with whatever I needed. I was relieved and grateful for his support. Maybe having someone else around would make the whole thing less terrifying. The next day, Mark showed up with a bag full of supplies, candles, more sage, and even a few crystals he'd picked up at a New Age shop. He was taking this more seriously than I expected, which made me feel a bit better. "All right, let's do this," he said, rolling up his sleeves. We spent the day setting up the space according to Clara's instructions. Mark's presence was a huge comfort, and we even managed to joke around a bit, which helped to lighten the mood. As we worked, I could almost convince myself that this was just an elaborate game, not a desperate attempt to rid myself of a sinister presence. That night, as we sat in the dimly lit living room, the air thick with the scent of sage, I felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was the power of ritual. or maybe it was just the relief of finally taking action. Either way, I was ready for whatever came next. The day of the ritual arrived, and I made my way to Clara's shop with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The shop was filled with the scent of incense, and Clara greeted me with a warm smile. "You're ready?" she asked. I nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Clara led me to a small, candle-lit room in the back of the shop. The walls were lined with shelves holding an assortment of strange objects, crystals, amulets, and jars filled with mysterious herbs. In the center of the room was a table covered with a dark cloth, upon which lay various ritual items, candles, bowls of water, and a small bell. "We're going to perform a binding ritual," Clara explained. "This will sever the connection between you and the spirit. It's crucial that you remain focused and follow my instructions exactly." I took a deep breath and nodded. Clara began by lighting the candles and murmuring a series of incantations. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy, the air thick with a sense of something unseen. She handed me a small silver knife and instructed me to prick my finger, letting a drop of blood fall into the bowl of water. I did as she said, wincing slightly at the sharp pain. As Clara continued her incantations, the water in the bowl began to ripple, as if stirred by an invisible hand. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Clara's voice grew louder, more insistent, and the candles flickered wildly. Suddenly, the room was filled with a deafening silence. The candles went out, plunging us into darkness. I felt a surge of panic, but Clara's calm voice cut through the blackness. "Stay still. Do not move." I obeyed, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like an eternity, Clara struck a match and relit the candles. The room seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. "It is done," Clara said, her voice steady. "The connection has been severed." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Clara instructed me to leave the bowl of water outside my front door overnight and to dispose of it the next morning. She also gave me a small amulet to wear as a protective charm. As I left the shop, I felt a sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, things were going to get better. That night, I placed the bowl of water outside my door and went to bed, wearing the amulet Clara had given me. For the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully, free from dreams of the old lady. The next morning, I disposed of the water as instructed, feeling a sense of closure. But as I went about my day, a nagging doubt lingered at the back of my mind. Had the ritual truly worked, or was the worst yet to come? For a few blissful days after the ritual, I felt like a new person. The oppressive weight that had been bearing down on me seemed to lift, and I started to believe that the worst was behind me. I went back to work, caught up with friends, and even managed to enjoy a few nights out. The old lady's haunting presence felt like a distant, almost surreal memory. However, it didn't take long for the sense of unease to creep back in. It started with small things. Objects in my apartment were slightly out of place, lights flickering unexpectedly, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just being paranoid, or perhaps I was still on edge from the whole ordeal. But then the occurrences became more frequent and harder to dismiss. One evening, I came home to find my front door ajar. I was certain I had locked it that morning. My heart raced as I stepped inside, cautiously checking each room. Nothing seemed to be missing, but the air felt heavy, charged with a sense of foreboding. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I called Mark. He had been my rock through all of this, and I needed his level-headedness now more than ever. "Mark, something's not right," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you come over?" "Of course, I'll be there in 20 minutes. he replied without hesitation. When he arrived, we went through the apartment together. Mark was thorough, checking every corner and even the attic, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Still, he could sense my unease. Maybe it's just residual fear from everything that's happened, he suggested. But if it'll make you feel better, I can stay over tonight. I gratefully accepted his offer, and we spent the evening watching movies and trying to distract ourselves from the strange occurrences. As the night wore on, I felt a bit more relaxed, but that changed when we decided to call it a night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of faint whispering. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but the voices grew louder and more insistent. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, and realized the sound was coming from the living room. Quietly, I crept out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway. Mark was already awake, standing in the doorway with a look of confusion and fear on his face. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, and we cautiously moved towards the living room. The whispering grew louder, almost as if it were surrounding us. Just as we reached the doorway, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. We looked around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything that could explain the noise. "That's it," Mark said, his voice firm. "We need more help. This is beyond us." The next morning, we reached out to Clara again. When we told her what had been happening, she listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. "It sounds like the spirit wasn't fully banished," she said finally. "Sometimes these things are more persistent than we expect. We'll need to take stronger measures." Clara suggested we perform a more intense cleansing ritual, this time involving not just my apartment, but also me personally. She explained that sometimes spirits can attach themselves to people rather than places, and a personal cleansing might be necessary to fully sever the connection. We scheduled the cleansing for the following evening. Mark insisted on being there, and Clara agreed that having another person present would be helpful. That day, we gathered the necessary supplies, more sage, candles, holy water, and a few additional items Clara had specified. As the sun set, we began the ritual. Clara led us through a series of steps, burning sage and chanting incantations. She sprinkled holy water around the apartment and on me, while Mark held the candles and assisted as needed. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. At one point, Clara asked me to stand in the center of the room while she circled around me, chanting and shaking a bundle of herbs. I closed my eyes, focusing on her words, trying to remain calm. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and sending a chill down my spine. "Stay strong," Clara urged. "We're almost done." The wind picked up, swirling around us, and the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. It felt like the room was closing in on me, the voices pressing in from all sides. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop, to end. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The wind died down, the whispers ceased, and the candles relit themselves, casting a warm glow over the room. Clara finished her chant, her voice steady and calm. "It is done," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "This time, the spirit is truly gone." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, my body sagging with exhaustion. Mark stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Let's hope this is the end of it," he said. As we cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. But as I went to bed that night, wearing the protective amulet Clara had given me, I couldn't help but wonder if the worst was truly behind me, or if this was just another calm before the storm. For a few weeks after the intense cleansing ritual, life seemed to return to normal. The unsettling incidents stopped, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. Mark and I went back to our regular routines, and even Clara checked in occasionally to ensure everything was all right. I began to believe that the nightmare was finally over. However, as the days passed, I noticed small signs that something was still off. It started with the occasional cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, followed by flickering lights, and then the whispers, faint and barely audible, but unmistakable. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just residual fear, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I opened my eyes and saw the old lady standing at the foot of my bed. Her piercing blue eyes bore into mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. She didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. I knew I had to confront her once and for all. Summoning all my courage, I sat up and faced her. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. Her lips curled into a thin, eerie smile. "You sought knowledge in places you shouldn't have," she whispered. "Now you must face the consequences." "Why me?" I asked, frustration and fear mingling in my voice. "What did I do to deserve this?" "You opened a door," she replied, her voice cold and emotionless. "And now, it cannot be closed." Determined to end this, I reached for the amulet Clara had given me, clutching it tightly in my hand. "Leave me alone," I said firmly. "You have no power over me." To my surprise, the old lady recoiled slightly, her smile fading. I felt a surge of confidence and continued, "You are not welcome here. Leave now, and never return." The old lady's form began to waver, flickering like a candle in the wind. For a moment, I thought she would disappear entirely, but then she let out a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down my spine. "You think you can banish me so easily?" she sneered. "The curse is part of you now. It will never truly be gone." With that, she vanished, leaving me alone in the dark room, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't face this alone anymore. I needed Clara's help once more, and this time we had to find a permanent solution. The next morning, I contacted Clara and told her everything. She listened patiently, her face growing more serious with each detail. "It seems this spirit is more powerful than we anticipated," she said. "We need to perform a final, more powerful ritual to sever the connection once and for all." We gathered that evening at Clara's shop, along with Mark, who insisted on being there for support. Clara prepared the space meticulously, setting up protective symbols and lighting candles. She explained that this ritual would be more intense and required absolute focus and determination from all of us. As we began, Clara instructed me to stand in the center of the room while she and Mark formed a circle around me, holding hands. She chanted in a language I didn't understand, her voice strong and commanding. The air grew heavy, and I felt a familiar chill creep over me. Suddenly the room filled with a blinding light, and the old lady appeared in the center of the circle, her eyes blazing with anger. She lunged towards me, but Clara's voice rose above the chaos, her chant growing louder and more powerful. "By the power of light, I command you to leave," Clara shouted, her voice echoing through the room. The old lady screamed, a sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. She writhed and twisted, her form flickering and fading. I held the amulet tightly, repeating Clara's words in my mind, focusing all my energy on banishing the spirit. After what felt like an eternity, the old lady let out one final agonized scream and vanished into thin air. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting instantly. Clara collapsed to her knees, exhausted, while Mark and I rushed to her side. "It's done," Clara said weakly, a small smile on her face. "She's gone for good." Relief washed over me, and I helped Clara to her feet, grateful beyond words. We spent the next few minutes cleaning up and ensuring that every trace of the ritual was properly dispelled. As we left Clara's shop, I felt a sense of peace and closure that I hadn't felt in a long time. In the days that followed, there were no more whispers, no cold breezes, and no signs of the old lady. My life slowly returned to normal, and I was able to move on from the haunting experience. I remained cautious, always mindful of the boundaries I had crossed, and I never again ventured into the dark corners of the internet. Mark and I grew closer through the ordeal, our friendship strengthened by the trials we had faced together. And Clara, with her wisdom and guidance, became a trusted friend and advisor. I learned the hard way that some doors are better left unopened, and that curiosity can sometimes lead us into dark and dangerous places. But most importantly, I learned that with the help of true friends and a little bit of courage, even the darkest of curses can be broken. Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be sharing something like this here, but I honestly don't know where else to turn. I hope this doesn't come off as too bizarre, but I need to know if anyone else has had a similar experience. Here's my story, and it's still giving me chills just thinking about it. A few months ago, I was in a pretty dark place. I spent way too much time online, diving deep into the internet's weirdest corners. One night I stumbled upon a forum that led me to the dark web. I know, it sounds cliché, but curiosity got the better of me. I found myself on a site filled with puzzles and riddles, some benign, others quite disturbing. One particular riddle caught my eye. The riddle was simple yet cryptic. In the shadow of the iron giant, the truth lies beneath the whispering trees. Find me where the earth meets the darkened sky. I don't know what it was about this riddle, but it felt like it was calling to me. I spent hours trying to solve it, digging through various forums and cross-referencing obscure legends and maps. Eventually, I realized it was referring to an old abandoned mine near a forest on the outskirts of a small town about an hour's drive from where I live. I grew up hearing stories about that mine. It's been closed for decades, ever since an accident that killed a few miners. Some say it's cursed. Others believe it's haunted by the spirits of the miners who died there. It didn't help that the forest surrounding it is dense and foreboding, filled with ancient trees that seem to whisper secrets when the wind blows. Despite the creepy backstory, I was more intrigued than scared. I decided to check it out. Here's where things start to get really weird. I packed a small bag with essentials, flashlight, water, some snacks, and a fully charged phone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going because, frankly, it sounded insane even to me. Driving there felt surreal. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. The road leading to the forest was old and poorly maintained, and as I drove deeper, my phone signal dropped completely. Parking my car at the edge of the forest, I hesitated for a moment. The trees looked even more menacing in person, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. But I pushed forward, flashlight in hand, following a barely there trail towards the mine. This is where my memory gets fuzzy. I remember the path becoming narrower and the air growing colder. I remember feeling like I was being watched, though I saw no one. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the silence was deafening. At some point I must have reached the mine because the next thing I know I'm waking up in my bed, my clothes covered in dirt and my head pounding. Here's the disturbing part. I found footage on my phone. Somehow, I managed to record my entire journey. The video starts with me entering the forest, muttering to myself about the riddle. As I get closer to the mine, the footage becomes more erratic. I'm breathing heavily, and there's this eerie whispering in the background that wasn't there when I was recording. At one point, the screen goes black, but the audio continues, and what I hear still haunts me. There are voices, indistinct but definitely there, whispering my name. I can hear myself panicking, my breathing frantic. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the video cuts out. The last thing I see is a flash of something that looks like an old, decrepit face peering out from the darkness. I have no memory of any of this. I've gone back to the forest once since then, but I couldn't bring myself to go all the way to the mine. Something about that place feels fundamentally wrong, like it's out of sync with the rest of the world. So, Reddit, has anyone else experienced something like this? Am I just losing my mind? Or is there really something out there? Hey Reddit, thanks for all the responses and advice on my last post. I honestly didn't expect so many people to be interested in my story. Some of you suggested I see a doctor or get some sort of mental health checkup, which I did, just to be safe. Everything came back normal, which only deepened the mystery of what happened that night. After my initial post, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover. I decided to review the footage again, this time more carefully. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. During the few moments when the screen wasn't pitch black, I caught glimpses of something etched into the walls of the mine. Symbols, or runes maybe. They looked ancient and ominous, but I couldn't make any sense of them. I took screenshots and posted them online, hoping someone might recognize them. A few hours later, I got a message from a user claiming to be a historian specializing in local folklore and ancient symbols. He told me the symbols were a mix of old mining marks and something far older, possibly dating back to indigenous tribes that lived in the area centuries ago. He mentioned that these symbols were often associated with protection and warding off evil spirits. The historian's message intrigued me, but also made me uneasy. Why would such symbols be in an old mine? Were they there to protect the miners from something, or perhaps to keep something in? Determined to find out more, I decided to dig into the town's history. I visited the local library and spent hours poring over old newspapers and town records. The mine accident, which I initially thought was a simple tragedy, had a much darker backstory. According to the reports, the miners had unearthed something deep within the earth, something that terrified them. There were mentions of strange noises and inexplicable accidents leading up to the collapse. Some miners even claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving in the darkness. One article in particular caught my attention. It was a first-hand account from one of the few survivors of the collapse. He described feeling an overwhelming sense of dread as they dug deeper, and the night before the accident, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the mine, whispering something he couldn't understand. The next day, the mine caved in, and many lives were lost. Armed with this new information, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. I knew I had to go back, but this time I wouldn't go alone. I reached out to a couple of friends who were into urban exploration. I told them everything, and while they were skeptical, they were also intrigued and agreed to join me. The night before our planned visit, I had trouble sleeping. I kept dreaming about the mine and the forest, the whispers growing louder until they were almost deafening. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling more determined than ever to uncover the truth. We set out early the next morning, each of us carrying backpacks filled with gear, flashlights, rope, extra batteries, and a portable charger for my phone. We even brought walkie-talkies in case we lost cell service again. The drive to the forest was tense. My friends tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but I could tell they were nervous too. When we arrived, the forest was just as eerie as I remembered. The towering trees cast long shadows that seemed to dance as the wind rustled the leaves. We followed the same path I took last time, this time moving more slowly, scanning our surroundings carefully. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. As we neared the mine, the air grew colder, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. We found the entrance, a dark, gaping hole in the earth, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I took a deep breath and led the way inside. The beam of my flashlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the walls covered in those strange symbols. As we ventured deeper, the whispering started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. My friends looked at me, wide-eyed, clearly hearing it too. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the historian. His message sent a chill down my spine. Be careful. Those symbols are not just for protection. They're warnings. You might be dealing with something far more dangerous than you realize. We exchanged nervous glances, but pressed on, determined to get to the bottom of this mystery. Little did we know, the real horror was yet to come. Hey Reddit, I'm back with the next part of my story. If you've been following along, you know things have already been pretty strange and unsettling. What we encountered next, though, took things to a whole new level. We stood at the entrance of the mine, the historian's warning fresh in our minds. The whispering was growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices echoing through the dark. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to back out now. We had come this far and we needed to see it through. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Our flashlights cast long, flickering shadows on the walls, revealing more of those ancient symbols. Some of them were partially eroded, but others were disturbingly clear, almost as if they'd been recently carved. As we ventured deeper, the path sloped downward, the walls narrowing around us. The whispering became more distinct, and I could almost make out words, though they were in a language I didn't understand. My friend Sam, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped and shone his flashlight on the ground. There, half buried in the dirt, was an old rusted pickaxe. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. "Do you think this belonged to one of the miners?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably," I replied, my eyes scanning the darkness ahead. But why would they leave it here? We continued on, our footsteps echoing in the confined space. Suddenly, our flashlights flickered, then went out altogether. We stood in complete darkness, the whispering now a low, menacing chant. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the spare batteries in my bag. Just as I was about to replace them, my phone buzzed again. It was another message from the historian. "The spirits are restless. Whatever you do, don't disturb anything." Before I could react, a cold gust of wind blew through the tunnel, extinguishing the faint light from our phone screens. We were plunged into total darkness, the whispering now deafening. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and spun around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the touch. There was nothing there. Panic started to set in. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." We turned to leave, but the tunnel seemed different. The walls appeared to have shifted, and the path we had come down was no longer clear. It was as if the mine was alive, its passages rearranging themselves to keep us trapped. In our confusion, we stumbled upon a small chamber. In the center of the room was a large flat stone, surrounded by more of those strange symbols. The stone was covered in what looked like old, dried blood. Sam shone his flashlight on the wall behind the stone, revealing a crude drawing of what appeared to be a ritual. Figures stood around the stone, their faces contorted in agony or terror, while a shadowy figure loomed over them. "What is this place?" my friend Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "It looks like some kind of sacrificial altar," I replied, my mind racing. "But why would it be here in the mine?" Before we could speculate further, the temperature dropped suddenly, and a thick mist began to fill the chamber. The whispering grew louder, the voices now clearly chanting in an ancient, guttural language. The walls seemed to close in on us, and I could feel an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. Without warning, the stone in the center of the room began to glow with an eerie, pulsating light. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, as if they were alive. We backed away slowly, but the mist grew thicker, enveloping us in a dense, suffocating fog. Out of the mist, a figure emerged. It was tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It reached out towards us, and I felt an icy chill run through my body. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure seemed to be drawing closer, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of fear and despair. Just when I thought all was lost, the figure stopped and spoke in a voice that echoed through the chamber, a voice that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. "You should not be here," it said, its tone both angry and sorrowful. "Leave this place and never return." In an instant, the mist cleared, and the figure vanished. The temperature returned to normal, and the whispering ceased. We stood there, shaken and disoriented, trying to comprehend what had just happened. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and ran, retracing our steps as best we could. The mine seemed to resist our escape, but eventually we found our way back to the entrance. As we emerged into the daylight, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, but the sense of dread lingered. We drove back in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something truly evil. The historian's warnings echoed in my mind, and I knew that whatever was in that mine was better left undisturbed. I'm still trying to process everything that happened, and I'm not sure what to do next. Part of me wants to forget the whole thing, but another part is desperate for answers. I'm hoping someone here might have some insight or advice. Thanks for listening, Reddit. Hey Reddit, I'm back with part 4 of my story. Thanks for all the support and suggestions. After our last encounter in the mine, my friends and I were pretty shaken up. The experience left us with more questions than answers, and I knew I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand what we had encountered and why it had such a profound effect on us. After some consideration, I decided to reach out to the historian again. I sent him a detailed account of our experience, including the glowing stone, the mist, and the shadowy figure. His response was swift and filled with concern. He told me that the mine was likely built on an ancient burial ground, possibly linked to a long-forgotten tribe known for their shamanistic practices. The symbols we saw were not just protective wards, but were also meant to contain something that should never be released. The glowing stone, he speculated, was an altar used in rituals to communicate with the spirit world. The shadowy figure we encountered could have been a guardian spirit, angered by our intrusion. This new information was both fascinating and terrifying. I realized that our exploration had disturbed something ancient and powerful. I shared this with my friends, and while they were hesitant, they agreed that we needed to learn more. We decided to meet with the historian in person to get a better understanding of what we were dealing with. The historian, Dr. Edwin Hayes, lived in a nearby town. He was an older man with a wealth of knowledge about the local area and its history. When we arrived at his home, he welcomed us warmly and led us to his study, a room filled with books, maps, and artifacts. We spent hours discussing the mine, the symbols, and our experience. Dr. Hayes explained that the area around the mine had always been considered sacred by the indigenous people. They believed it was a place where the veil between our world and the spirit world was thin. The mine itself was an affront to this belief, and when it was dug, it disrupted the balance. The miners' accounts of strange occurrences and shadowy figures were likely encounters with spirits angered by the disturbance. He showed us old maps and documents, including some writings in an ancient script that detailed rituals performed at the site. These rituals were meant to appease the spirits and maintain the balance. Dr. Hayes warned us that our presence in the mine, especially our interaction with the altar, had likely reignited these ancient tensions. As we pored over the documents, a sense of urgency grew within me. We needed to find a way to make things right, to restore the balance we had disrupted. Dr. Hayes suggested that we perform a cleansing ritual, similar to those conducted by the original inhabitants. He warned us that it would be dangerous and that we had to follow the instructions precisely. Determined to set things right, we agreed to undertake the ritual. Dr. Hayes provided us with a detailed guide, including the materials we would need and the specific steps to follow. We gathered everything over the next few days, preparing ourselves mentally and physically for the task ahead. The night before we planned to return to the mine, I had another disturbing dream. I was back in the forest, surrounded by whispering trees and the oppressive darkness of the mine. The shadowy figure appeared again, but this time it spoke to me in a language I couldn't understand. Despite the language barrier, I felt its message was clear. We were running out of time. The next day we set out early, determined to perform the ritual and hopefully put an end to the disturbances. The drive to the forest was filled with a mix of fear and resolve. We arrived at the mine just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the growing darkness. We entered the mine with our flashlights and ritual supplies. The atmosphere was as oppressive as before, but this time, we were prepared. We found our way back to the chamber with the altar, the symbols on the walls seeming to glow faintly in the dim light. Following Dr. Hayes's instructions, we set up the ritual. We placed offerings on the altar, herbs, water, and a small stone carved with protective symbols. We then lit candles and incense, their flickering light casting eerie shadows on the walls. We began to chant the words provided by Dr. Hayes, an ancient prayer meant to appease the spirits and restore the balance. The air grew colder, and the whispering returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It felt as though the mine itself was reacting to our presence, the walls closing in around us. As we continued the ritual, the mist began to form again, swirling around us in a thick, suffocating fog. The shadowy figure appeared, its eyes glowing with the same malevolent light as before. But this time, instead of advancing, it seemed to watch, its gaze fixed on the altar. We finished the chant, and for a moment there was silence. Then, a low rumble echoed through the mine, and the mist began to dissipate. The shadowy figure slowly faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. We stood there breathless and shaking, hoping that we had done enough. We made our way out of the mine, the air feeling lighter and less foreboding. As we stepped into the cool night air, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. We had done it. We had performed the ritual and hopefully restored the balance. Back home, I contacted Dr. Hayes to let him know what had happened. He congratulated us and reminded us that some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets hidden for a reason. His words resonated with me, and I knew I would never forget our experience. I'm still processing everything, but I feel a sense of closure. I hope our actions have made a difference and that the spirits of the mine can finally rest in peace. Thanks for listening, Reddit. I'll update you if anything else happens. Hey Reddit, it's been a journey, but here's the final part of my story. After the ritual in the mine, things started to settle down. My friends and I felt a sense of relief, but the experience had left a mark on all of us. For a while, life returned to normal. We each went back to our routines, but the events of those nights in the mine lingered in the back of our minds. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something left unresolved. I continued to research, reading more about the local history and the legends surrounding the forest and the mine. One day, I received a call from Dr. Hayes. He had been doing some research of his own and found something that might interest me. He invited me over to discuss it. When I arrived, he greeted me with a look of grave concern. "I've been digging into the history of that area more deeply," he said, leading me to his study. "There's an old legend that speaks of a guardian spirit bound to protect the sacred ground. According to the stories, once disturbed, the spirit's wrath could only be quelled by a true act of atonement." We sat down, and he showed me an old manuscript. It was fragile and written in a language I couldn't understand, but Dr. Hayes translated it for me. The legend spoke of a spirit bound to the mine, a protector of the ancient burial grounds. Disturbing this spirit could bring misfortune, but restoring balance required more than just a ritual. It required a promise to protect the land from future harm. Dr. Hayes suggested that we make a formal commitment to preserve the site and honor its significance. He believed that this final act of respect and dedication might be the key to fully appeasing the guardian spirit. Although it sounded a bit unconventional, it felt like the right thing to do. I contacted my friends, and they agreed to join me one last time. We arranged a meeting with the town council to discuss our plan. To our surprise, they were receptive. Many of them had grown up hearing the same stories and understood the importance of preserving the site. They agreed to designate the area around the mine as protected land, ensuring it would remain undisturbed. A few days later, we gathered at the edge of the forest with members of the town council, Dr. Hayes, and a few locals who had come to show their support. We stood together, looking out over the dense trees and the path leading to the mine. Dr. Hayes led a brief ceremony, acknowledging the history and significance of the land. We each made a personal vow to respect and protect the site. As we spoke, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, as if the forest itself was acknowledging our promise. After the ceremony, we walked back to our cars, the weight of the past few weeks lifting from our shoulders. I felt a profound sense of closure, knowing that we had done everything we could to make things right. In the weeks that followed, the town began to embrace the history of the mine and the surrounding forest. They put up signs and informational plaques, educating visitors about the significance of the site and the importance of preserving it. The area became a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of the past and a testament to our commitment to respect the land. Reflecting on everything that happened, I realize how much this journey changed me. I started off driven by curiosity and a sense of adventure, but along the way, I learned about respect, history, and the importance of listening to the wisdom of those who came before us. I hope my story serves as a reminder to be mindful of the past and to honor the places that hold historical and spiritual significance. Thanks for sticking with me, Reddit. I appreciate all the support and advice you've given me throughout this journey. If anything else happens, you'll be the first to know. So here's something that happened to me a few months ago, and it's still messing with my head. I've always been a bit of a tech geek, and one night, my curiosity got the best of me. I decided to explore the dark web. Yeah, I know, classic horror story beginning, right? But bear with me, I'd read about the dark web before, how it's a hidden part of the internet where you can find all sorts of illicit activities. I wasn't really looking for anything specific, just snooping around to see what it was all about. After some browsing through forums and marketplaces, I stumbled upon a chat room that seemed relatively benign compared to some of the other stuff out there. The chat room was filled with people discussing everything from conspiracy theories to underground music. I was lurking, not really contributing, just observing. Then, out of nowhere, someone posted a link. It was just a random string of characters, and before I even realized what I was doing, I clicked on it. Immediately, my screen went black. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to move the mouse, but nothing happened. I was frozen, staring at the dark screen, and then my computer restarted itself. I was freaking out, wondering if I'd just downloaded some crazy virus. When my desktop finally reappeared, there was this new icon in the middle of the screen. It was a creepy-looking box with strange, unsettling text on it. The text read, "Play now." I hesitated for what felt like an eternity. I mean, it was late, I was alone, and this whole situation was giving me major chills. But for some stupid reason, curiosity got the best of me again. I clicked, "Play now." The screen flickered and suddenly my webcam light turned on. My own face stared back at me from the screen, and then I noticed there were other faces too, maybe a dozen of them, all looking directly at their own cameras. They looked terrified. A chill ran down my spine as they all began to speak, their voices overlapping in a chaotic whisper. "Run. Run as far as you can. Leave everything behind if you value your life." It was like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to close the laptop, to shut it off, but I was frozen with fear. These people, they looked so real, so genuinely scared. After what felt like an eternity, the screen went black again, and the game closed itself. I sat there in the silence of my room, trying to process what had just happened. It had to be a prank, right? Some elaborate hoax to scare curious idiots like me off the dark web. But then things started getting weirder. The next day at college, I noticed people looking at me strangely. It wasn't my usual crowd either. These were strangers, people I'd never seen before, and they seemed to be watching my every move. When I asked my friends if they noticed anything weird, they just shrugged it off, telling me I was being paranoid. That evening, I saw him for the first time, a gaunt old man standing across the street from my apartment. He was staring directly at my window. I closed the blinds, trying to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. But he was there the next day, and the day after that. I started to realize that maybe this wasn't just a prank. Something was happening, and I had no idea what to do. Every instinct in my body told me to run, just like the people on the screen had said. But where could I go? How could I possibly leave everything behind? And that's when I knew I had to go into hiding. I couldn't stay in my apartment, couldn't go to college. I had to disappear to get off the grid. My life depended on it. But how do you hide from something you don't even understand? Leaving everything behind isn't as easy as it sounds. When you've got a life, friends, family, responsibilities, it's hard to just vanish. But after the old man showed up a few more times, always watching, I knew I didn't have a choice. Something was seriously wrong, and staying put wasn't an option. I started planning my disappearance methodically. First, I needed a new identity, or at least enough of a cover to avoid being traced. I deleted all my social media accounts and wiped my phone. I packed a small bag with essentials, clothes, some cash, a few snacks. I'd seen enough movies to know that leaving a digital trail could be my undoing, so I left my laptop and any traceable electronics behind. I told my closest friend, Sam, that I was going on a road trip to clear my head. I didn't tell him the truth because, honestly, who would believe me? People on a creepy game telling me to run for my life. An old man stalking me? It sounded insane, even to me. I got into my car and drove. I didn't have a plan, just a desperate need to get away. For the first few days, I hopped from motel to motel, paying in cash, trying to stay as low-key as possible. I avoided talking to anyone and made sure not to use my real name. One night I was in a small town, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, and strangers stick out like sore thumbs. I checked into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The room was shabby, but it was a place to sleep. I locked the door and pushed a chair against it for good measure. I was exhausted. The constant fear and paranoia were taking a toll on me. I lay down on the lumpy bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Just as I was about to drift off, there was a knock at the door. My heart pounded in my chest. Who would be knocking at this hour? I stayed still, hoping they'd go away, but the knocking persisted. Slowly, I got up and crept to the door, trying to peer through the peephole without making a sound. There was no one there. I stood there, frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a mistake, a prank, maybe. I went back to bed, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside had me on edge. The next morning, I checked out early, moving further into the countryside. The sense of being watched never left me. Every town I passed through, I felt like eyes were on me. I started noticing the same car, a beat-up old sedan following me. It would disappear for a while, only to show up again miles down the road. I couldn't keep running forever. I needed a plan, a place where I could lay low and figure out what was happening. That's when I remembered an old cabin my family used to rent for summer vacations. It was in a remote area, miles away from the nearest town, perfect for hiding. The drive there was long and nerve-wracking. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting the sedan to reappear, but it didn't. When I finally reached the cabin, it was just as I remembered. Old, a bit run down, but secluded. I settled in, trying to make the place as comfortable as possible. The first few days were uneventful. I began to relax, thinking maybe I'd finally shaken off whoever was following me. I spent my time reading old books left behind by previous renters and taking long walks in the woods surrounding the cabin. But one evening, as the sun was setting, I heard a noise outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart raced. I peered out the window, but saw nothing. Maybe it was an animal, I told myself. Yet the uneasy feeling persisted. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Then a soft tapping on the window. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I finally gathered the courage to look. There, standing just outside the window, was the old man. His eyes locked onto mine, and he mouthed something I couldn't hear. I backed away, tripping over the bed in my haste. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting by the door with a makeshift weapon, a heavy lamp, clutched in my hands. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. The sense of safety the cabin had provided was shattered. I needed to keep moving. But where to? The dark web game, the people's warning, the old man. What did it all mean? And how could I escape something that seemed to know my every move? As I packed up and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I'd never truly be safe again. Leaving the cabin was a no-brainer. I couldn't stay in a place where the old man could find me so easily. I drove without a clear destination, just a vague idea to head somewhere busy, somewhere I could blend in. As I navigated through winding roads and small towns, I kept thinking about the chat room, the game, and the terrified faces. I needed answers, but who could I trust? Certainly not the authorities. Hey, I clicked a link on the dark web and now I'm being stalked by some creepy old dude. Yeah, that would go over well. I remembered a tech forum I used to frequent. It was filled with hackers and cybersecurity experts, people who knew their way around the web's dark corners. I found a dingy internet cafe and logged in, making sure to use a VPN to hide my location. I posted a detailed account of what had happened, minus a few identifying details, and waited. It didn't take long for the replies to come in. Most were dismissive, calling me an idiot for dabbling in the dark web, but one message stood out. It was from a user named Phantom, who claimed to have seen something similar before. Phantom told me about a rumored dark web game that ensnared players by exploiting their curiosity. It started with a link and ended with real-world consequences. According to Phantom, the game was created by a group of hackers with twisted motives, and once you were in, it was nearly impossible to escape. He advised me to ditch my car, get a burner phone, and head to a major city where I could lose myself in the crowd. He also mentioned a place, a small hidden library in the city that catered to people looking for obscure information. Phantom said it was the best place to find clues about the game and how to possibly end it. Feeling a bit more hopeful, I followed his advice. I sold my car for cash at a used car dealership, bought a cheap prepaid phone, and caught a bus to the city. The journey was long and nerve-wracking. Every time someone glanced my way, I felt a surge of panic. When I finally arrived, the city was a maze of people and buildings. It was easy to disappear here. I made my way to the library Phantom mentioned. It was tucked away in a quiet alley, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. Inside it was musty and dimly lit, with shelves crammed full of old books and dusty tomes. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted me with a nod. I asked her about the game, half expecting her to laugh me off. But instead she led me to a back room filled with old computers and stacks of ancient-looking books. She handed me a book with a worn leather cover. "This might help," she said, "but be careful. Knowledge can be as dangerous as ignorance." The book was filled with stories and accounts of people who had encountered similar games on the dark web. It detailed their experiences, the eerie similarities to mine, and in some cases how they'd managed to break free. One story caught my eye. It was about a man who had survived the game by finding its creator and confronting him. According to the account, the creator was a former cybersecurity expert who had turned rogue after losing everything. His twisted game was a way to exert control, to play God in the lives of unsuspecting victims. The man in the story had tracked down the creator by following a series of cryptic clues hidden within the game. It wasn't easy, and it involved a lot of risks, but eventually, he had confronted the creator and destroyed the main server running the game. It was the only way to ensure it stopped for good. Armed with this new information, I knew what I had to do. It was risky, possibly even suicidal, but it was my only shot at freedom. I needed to find the creator and end this nightmare once and for all. I spent the next few days poring over the book and trying to find any clues that might lead me to the creator. Every detail mattered. The locations, the patterns, the hidden messages. It was like piecing together a dark, twisted puzzle. But time was running out. The old man, the stalkers, they were getting closer. I could feel it, and I knew that my next move had to be precise. One wrong step, and I might never get another chance to escape this living nightmare. With the book in hand and a rough plan forming, I knew it was time to start the hunt. The first clue from the book hinted at a small, obscure tech shop on the other side of the city. Supposedly, the shop's owner had ties to the game's creator. It was my first lead, and I had to follow it. The shop was tucked away in a dingy part of town, surrounded by graffiti-covered walls and broken streetlights. Inside, it was cluttered with old computers, cables, and various electronic parts. The owner, a grizzled man with piercing eyes, looked up as I entered. "I'm looking for some rare hardware," I said, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. He raised an eyebrow. "Depends on what you're looking for. We've got a bit of everything." I leaned in and lowered my voice. "I'm looking for information about a game, a dark web game." His expression changed instantly, from mild curiosity to intense scrutiny. "Not here," he muttered, gesturing for me to follow him to the back room. The back room was even more cluttered, filled with boxes and outdated tech. He shut the door behind us and turned to face me. "You're in over your head, kid, but if you're serious, there's someone you need to talk to." He gave me an address and a name, Dr. Alice Thornton, a former cybersecurity expert turned reclusive hacker. According to him, she was one of the few people who might know how to track down the game's creator. Finding Dr. Thornton wasn't easy. She lived off the grid in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of the city. The place looked abandoned, with overgrown weeds and boarded-up windows. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few tense moments, the door creaked open, and a woman in her late 50s with wild, unkempt hair and sharp eyes peered out. "Who are you, and what do you want?" I explained my situation, showing her the book and recounting my experience with the game. She listened intently, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed. "You're not the first to come looking for answers, and you won't be the last. But if you want my help, you need to understand something. This game is more than just code. It's a psychological trap designed to break you." She invited me in and led me to a cluttered room filled with monitors and computer equipment. As she typed away on her keyboard, she explained the game's origins. It had been created by a man named Vincent Blackwood, a once brilliant programmer who had lost everything in a corporate scandal. He disappeared, re-emerging years later as the mastermind behind the dark web game. "Blackwood thrives on chaos," Dr. Thornton said. "He's built this game to manipulate and control. The people you saw on your screen, they're real and they've been caught in his web for too long." I shuddered, remembering the terrified faces. "How do I find him?" She handed me a flash drive. "This contains a trace program. It's risky, but if you can get close enough to one of his servers, it might lead you to him. Be careful. Blackwood's not just a hacker. He's a predator." Armed with the trace program, I knew my next step was to find one of Blackwood's servers. Dr. Thornton pointed me to an abandoned warehouse rumored to house one of his many hidden servers. It was a dangerous mission, but I was out of options. The warehouse was exactly as she described. Dark, empty, and eerie. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. I found a hidden door leading to the basement, where rows of servers blinked ominously in the dim light. I inserted the flash drive and initiated the trace program. The screen filled with lines of code, tracking data points and network paths. Suddenly, the screen flashed with an address, a remote location outside the city. My heart raced. This was it, the lead to Blackwood. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps above me. Panic surged through me. Someone was coming. I quickly pulled out the flash drive and shut down the terminal, slipping into the shadows just as the door creaked open. The old man stood there, his eyes scanning the room. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed perfectly still, hidden behind a stack of crates. After what felt like an eternity, he left, and I exhaled in relief. I knew where I needed to go now. But with the old man hot on my trail, I had to be more careful than ever. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a battle for survival, and I was determined to win. The address from the trace program led me to a desolate farmhouse far from the city. It was isolated, surrounded by fields and woods, the perfect place for someone to hide and operate undetected. As I approached, the air felt heavy with foreboding. This was it, the end game. I parked my car a mile away and made my way through the woods, careful to stay out of sight. The farmhouse looked abandoned at first glance, but as I got closer, I noticed subtle signs of life. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a faint glow from one of the windows. I crept up to the house and peered inside. The interior was a chaotic mess of old furniture, discarded papers, and computer equipment. And there, at the center, was Vincent Blackwood, hunched over a computer, completely absorbed in his work. His face was illuminated by the cold light of the monitor, revealing a man worn by time and obsession. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door. It creaked loudly and Blackwood's head snapped up. For a moment we just stared at each other, the silence thick with tension. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he said finally, his voice cold and calculating. "You ruined my life," I shot back, stepping inside. "You and your sick game," he smirked. "Ah, the game. It's more than just a game, you know. It's a test, a way to weed out the weak and find those who are truly worthy." I felt a surge of anger. Worthy? You're tormenting people, ruining their lives. For what? Your twisted amusement? Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous intensity. "You don't understand. This world is full of sheep, mindlessly following the herd. My game separates the sheep from the wolves." I took a step closer, my fists clenched. "Well, your game ends now." He laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "You think you can just walk in here and shut it all down? You're in over your head, kid." But I wasn't backing down. I pulled out the flash drive, the trace program still active. "I'm ending this, Blackwood. Your reign of terror stops here." For a moment, he looked genuinely curious. Then, with a speed that took me by surprise, he lunged at me. We grappled, knocking over equipment and scattering papers. Despite his age, Blackwood was strong and desperate, but so was I. In the struggle, I managed to plug the flash drive into his main server. The trace program activated, and the screens around us began to flash warnings and error messages. Blackwood screamed in rage, trying to pull me away, but it was too late. The program was doing its job, dismantling his network, exposing his operations. With a final shove, I broke free and grabbed a heavy bookend, smashing it into the server's main terminal. Sparks flew, and the screens went dark. Blackwood fell to his knees, defeated. "You think this ends with me?" he gasped, his voice filled with a mix of anger and resignation. "There are others. There will always be others." "Maybe," I said, breathing heavily. "But they won't be you, and they won't get away with it." As I turned to leave, I heard the distant wail of sirens. Dr. Thornton had promised to alert the authorities once the trace was complete. They arrived just as I stepped outside, their lights cutting through the dark. The police took Blackwood into custody, and I gave my statement, explaining everything. It was surreal, watching him being led away in handcuffs. The nightmare was finally over, or so I hoped. In the days that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. I reconnected with friends, returned to college, and slowly the shadows that had haunted me began to recede. The game, the old man, the stalking, it all felt like a distant, terrible dream. But some nights, when the wind howled outside my window, I'd think about the faces on my screen, the terrified whispers. I'd remember Blackwood's words, "There will always be others." I knew I had to stay vigilant to protect myself and those I cared about. The dark web was a place of shadows where monsters like Blackwood thrived. But as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, there was hope. And maybe, just maybe, that hope was enough to keep the darkness at bay.